Shalom, welcome back. I'd like to share some information that I've come across. This is definitely one of those videos that's more about kind of thinking outside the box kind of thing. So if you're one of these highly religious people who don't want to hear anything outside of the the Catholic authorized canon of Scripture, then you may want to disregard this video. But I've been listening to a YouTube creator that I just discovered named Asha Logos, and I'll put a link to the in the description of this video to some of his videos I'm going to talk about today. But Asha Logos, he does these very, very high quality, wonderful videos on history, history of the Scythians and various European tribes, the Mongols and the Gauls, and I can't say enough how good his videos are. They're very well done. They have terrific information, and as I've mentioned before in previous videos, I'm of the understanding that these people that Asha Logos is speaking about, as the Scythians and Parthians and so forth, that they're actually the descendants of the lost 10 tribes that were displaced by the Assyrians and eventually migrated into Europe. So there's a piece of literature that Mr. Logos did some videos about, and the name of it is the Oera Linda Book. And so what this is, it is a history of a particular family. Their surname was Linda. That's where the name comes from. Oera is a Frisian word for ancient, or primeval. So it's like this, the Oera Linda is like the I guess you could say the history of the Lindas, or the ancient Linda book. And this book was it was donated to the Frisian Provincial Library by the then owner Cornelius Over de Linden IV, who trusted that his donation would finally lead to a proper study of the document and its contents. Until today, this has never happened. The library states it is commonly believed to be a forgery, but substantiation of this belief is hard to find. The main evidence seems to be the fact that scholars do not take it seriously. Asking the question if the manuscript or its contents can be authentic, after all, seems to have been taboo in a Dutch academia since the late 1870s. The last notable who spoke favorably about the Oera Linda was librarian, historian, theologian, translator of the Bible into Frisian, and member of the Frisian Society, Gert Woemkes. And here's his quote: "It is less significant to me who wrote the Oera Linda book. What matters is the inherent spiritual value as a testimony to the Frisian love of freedom at a time when the national character was threatened by utter destruction, both its moral and literary quality, as well as the spirituality it expresses, I consider more relevant than the authenticity and historical facts." So, what this book is, it is a family history that was made over the course of several hundred years, and it was handed down through this family. And so the person who finally donated this book to the Frisian Society, Mr. Linden, he was a descendant of these numerous authors, and it's something that had been passed through his family for years. This statement by the Frisian Society that it's a forgery, the term forgery just means it's a copied document. It doesn't, it's not the same as meaning something is fake so much as it's copied. And a lot of times when people or groups don't want to deal with a document, they don't want to answer to its contents, they'll use this as an excuse. They'll say, well, that's a forgery. You see that with, for instance, the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. They claim there's a forgery rather than dealing with the contents that are in it, which the contents that are in it read like a prophecy that's coming true in our modern age, which tells me that that particular book is genuine. This particular book, I also feel that it's genuine. It's a wonderful book. It is filled with wisdom and almost like a proverbial type of knowledge of right and wrong, and it gives an understanding of what I would say is the Creator that ancient Europeans, these Frisians, who were essentially Norwegians, had. The way that the Creator is described in this book is very similar to the way that Yahweh is described by Peter, and of course Peter says he got his understanding of Yahweh from Yeshua himself. And one of the things that Mr. Asha Logos talks about, and he's got a series of videos, and the series is called Our Subverted History, and he goes through historical accounts that are not typically taught in school, and speaks about how history has been altered by making information hard to gain access to, or from supposedly debunking historical writings that they claim are like this is being claimed to be a forgery. And it's like these modern theologians that masquerade as historians will, they claim to know more about the history than those who actually lived through it. So they are the arbiters of truth and fiction, and firsthand testimonies from people who lived during historical events, those are false, and instead you should believe our version of history. One of the things that to me is one of the most interesting things that Asha Logos brings out in all of his videos is this study, this struggle throughout the ages between a what I would say is like a prophet type of persona versus the priest persona. And this is something that I've talked about before with regards to Scripture. It's something that where you almost see, if you really pay attention when you're reading the Bible, there is definitely this struggle between the prophets and the priests. We're often thought about as being on the same side, but the prophets quite frequently call the priests apostates, and for like Jeremiah, for instance, he blames the destruction of Jerusalem, the first destruction of Jerusalem, on the priests themselves. And it's the same way with Yeshua. Like, he's obviously a prophet, and he is condemning the priest class throughout the Scriptures, and eventually Jerusalem is destroyed again. So it's almost like a redux of Jeremiah's prophecies in 586 BC, and it came to pass again in 70 AD. And from what you can see in this Oera Linda book, it is not a struggle that was limited to Judea. This is a worldwide struggle that the Oera Linda book documents, not just in Friesland, which is up in Scandinavia, where the document hails from, but it's also spoken about in locations like India, in the Himalayas, in Egypt, all over the world. In this book, there's historical accounts of these Frisian people who traveled to different areas, and they keep running into this group which is trying to subvert their true belief in the Creator and replace it with this belief that's a mixture of sacrifices and sacraments and dogma, rather than this pure worship of the Creator. And that's the same thing that you see being taught by Yeshua. As he's saying, look, we need to get back to this pure worship. And it's something which I think has been missed by the church, and I think it's probably because a lot of the people in the church are part of this other group who wants to bind you to themselves and work as an arbiter of truth and work as like this intermediary between you and God. And there's so much information in his videos. I really, you've got to watch them. If this interests you at all, I would watch his videos and to fully get an understanding of what he is saying. And you can find a copy of this book free online. I'll try to remember to put a link in the description to where you can download a free copy of this book if you want to read it for yourself. But even in our studies on who is Esau Edom, you see this struggle too between the true people, the true Judeans, and then this usurper class of Judeans who are descended from Esau, who are essentially the Pharisees and Sadducees that Yeshua argued with. So, I guess without further discussion, I'm going to go ahead and get into this book. I know it's going to be a long presentation. There's so much I want to say about it, but I didn't want to make this into multiple videos. So I'm just going to make this one long video, and there's quite a bit more I could add. So it starts off with this creation epic, and the creation epic is very different than the creation epics we see in the Bible. And so this I guess maybe you could call it a phenomenon that's common in all religions. All religions have some type of creation epic. Of course, in the Bible, we have the creation epic at Genesis, and there's actually a second creation epic, which is in Noah's flood. Like Noah's flood is a type of creation epic. And I've read some people who were making a case for World War II itself being a modern day creation epic, where the way society changed after World War II. But in their theory of the creation epic, like Hitler was the Satan, and then you had the Jews who were like essentially made into gods, and it was a very interesting way to look at this history, which is mostly falsified. And in this Frisian book of this the Oera Linda, they have their own version of the creation epic. Now it is not the same. So they're dating the start of their people from this event which they talk about at land sinking. And at land, of course, very similar to Atlantis sinking. So I don't know whether it is actually Atlantis or not, but they do give some dates for when Atland sank. And when I compared it with my biblical chronology, it was only 50 years off from the biblical flood of Noah. So was it the same event? Whereas the Frisians call it the sinking of Atland versus the flood epic in Noah. So it could be based upon the same event. And of course, Noah had 3 sons, and his sons had 3 wives, and they spread out through the entire earth. So it would, in some way, if these do come from the same source event in history, it would make sense to me that these different oral traditions would have differences of them. But in the Oera Linda, there are 3 progenitors, just like in the biblical text. There's 3 new progenitors in this recreation epic, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. So whereas the creation epic in the Bible has Shem, Ham, and Japheth, in the Oera Linda it has these 3 women, Freya, Fenda, and Lydia. And each one of these 3 progenitors is one of the mother of the 3 primary races of men. The blacks, the whites, and what the Oera Linda calls the yellows. I do think that After reading the book, I think this group from Finda, which is the people that the book calls yellow, would probably include the people in the Middle East. Not just, we think of, yellow as being like Asian peoples. And the Oera Linda is very, very frank and matter of fact about the differences in these three races. Some of the things it says are rather shocking to our ears, which have been trained to never discuss race. And when you do discuss race, people want to criticize you. And even the videos I've done that discussed ethnicity, people would get their panties in a wad about it because I dared to speak about this forbidden topic that everybody thinks about but no one discusses. But the Oera Linda book is very frank about things, and some of the things I gotta say they're right about. Some of the things maybe not, but it can be shocking if you do choose to read the book. Just like the Bible has a story about the confusion of tongues at the Tower of Babel, the Oera Linda has a story about how the various languages came into effect. So there's a lot of similarities. Yes, it's very different, but rather than focusing on the differences between the Oera Linda book and Scripture, I think maybe let's just take a moment to consider the similarities, and there are a number of similarities. There's talk of a flood, there's talk of three progenitors of the human race, there's a talk of the changing of the languages, and whereas I think most people who study the Bible come away, with this understanding that Hebrew was like the original language and all the others were the confusion of tongues. In the Oera Linda, they claim that their Frisian language was the original and that the other languages were created by men. So I think that's maybe a good introduction. So we'll go ahead and get started on the actual slides. The following was inscribed on the walls of the freest Berg at Texland, as well as Stavia and Medezablik. It was Freya's day, 7 times 7 years since Festa had been ordained as folk mother by Freya's desire. The Berg Medezablik was ready, and a maiden was chosen. Then it was time for Festa to light the new lamp, and when that was done, in the presence of the folk, Freya called from her watchstar so that all could hear. Festa, take up your stylus and write the words that I could not say earlier. Festa did as she was told, and that is how we, Freya's children, received our primal history. These Bergs that they're talking about, in another translation of the Oera Linda, they called it Citadels. And so this Berg or Citadel was essentially like a large tower made of brick. And these citadels, or Bergs, they were essentially kind of like a temple or a church that was administered by these Berg maidens, who were young women who were virgins, who kept a fire burning in the citadel, which was of course, the origin story was that the first flame that they had was lit by Freya, who was their progenitor, and it was their duty to keep this fire burning. And these women were said to have prophetic abilities. They were essentially advisors to the elders of the village. Some commentaries will speak about this Frisian society as being like matriarchal. I don't think it was matriarchal because it spoke of having kings and male elders that ran the tribes, but it was more like the women were this advisory council who would give advice to the kings on how to proceed. This is our primal history. Ralda, who alone is whole and eternal, created the potential. Time began and wrought all things. The very earth herself. Earth bore all grasses, herbs, and trees, and cherished and all despised creatures. All that is good and cherished she brought forth by day, and all that is evil and despised she brought forth by night. After the 12th Yule fest she bore 3 girls, Lydia from glowing hot, Fenda from hot, and Freya from warm substance. So Ralda is their name for the creator. Ralda is the god that they spoke about, who I would say is their version of Yahweh. So if this is a creation epic from the descendants of Noah, it would make sense that they would have this understanding of who Yahweh was. And so Ralda seems to correspond in a lot of ways with the creator. The Yule Fest would be, you could think of it as like a New Year's. Of course, it occurred in the winter. We generally think of the Yule Fest as being like this pagan celebration around that Christmas is derived from. But reading about it in the Oera Linda, it seems more like it seems like something that may have started off as being a genuine type of worship for God, and then it eventually fell into paganism later on. It says, as they lay naked, Ralda fed them with his breath, so that mankind would be bound to him. So again, in the same way that Genesis chapter 1 speaks about Yahweh breathing in the Spirit into Adam, here you see Ralda feeding them with his breath. And they matured, they became fruitful, and desired pleasure. They received Ralda's ode in them, and so they each bore 12 sons and 12 daughters, twins each Yuletide. All of mankind has come from these. Lydia was black, curly-haired as the lambs, her eyes blazed like stars. Yes, the vulture's glance was Tibin next to hers. Fenda was yellow, and her hair was as a horse's mane, and Freya was white like snow in the red of dawn, and the blue of her eyes was more beautiful than the rainbow. So this is, and here we come into the stories of the 3 progenitors, Lydia, Fenda, and Freya. But I'm not going to go into all that. From this point, after it gives us this fairly long description of the three women, then we go back to this primal teaching, which is going into kind of like their early Torah in a sense. The primal teachings that were written on the wall of the Berg Tower were not copied into the book of Adela followers. I wonder why they left them out, but as this copy is mine, I will add them here for the sake of my kinsmen. So this is a note from one of the Lindens when they wrote the Oera Linda. It says, Primal Teachings. Hail to all children of Freya who love that which is good. Through them life on earth shall become blissful. Teach and proclaim to the nations. Ralda is the most ancient or primordial, over oldest, for he created all things. Ralda is all in all, for he is eternal and everlasting. Ralda is omnipresent, yet invisible. Therefore the being is called a spirit. All that we can see of him are the created beings that come and go through his life, because from Ralda all things proceed, and to him they return. Out of Ralda both the beginning and the end come, all things merge into him. Ralda is the only almighty being, because all other power is borrowed from him and returns to him. From Ralda all forces are derived, and all forces return to him again. Therefore he alone is the created being, and nothing is created outside of him. So if you were to take this passage, and everywhere it says Ralda, if you were to change that to Yahweh, would any of that be false? Would any of that not perfectly fit our understanding of who God is? This whole paragraph here sounds just like a description of Yahweh. It's just got a different name on it. Ralda established eternal principles, or Ewa, and all that was created, and regulations can only be good if they are founded upon these principles. Although all is part of Ralda, the malice of people is not from him. Malice comes from laziness, carelessness, and stupidity. Therefore it can harm the people, but never Ralda. Ralda is wisdom, and the Awa that he established are the books from which we can learn. No wisdom can be found or gathered outside of them. So again, his Awa would be like his commandments, his Torah, essentially. So if you were to replace Ralda with Yahweh in this passages that are on screen, and then replace Awa with Torah, could you disagree with this from our understanding of the biblical text? I see this as being completely compatible with what is in the Bible. People can see many things, but Ralda sees all things. People can learn many things, but Ralda knows all things. People can unlock many things, but to Ralda all is open. People are male and female, but Ralda creates both. People love and hate, but Ralda is only righteous. Therefore only Ralda is God, and there is no gods outside of him. With the wheel turning, all creation alters and changes, but only God is unalterable. Since Ralda is God, he cannot change, and since he endures, only he is being, everything else is emergence. So again, replace the name Ralda with Yahweh. Does any of this not fit the way Yeshua or his apostles described Yahweh? I think this is perfectly in line with what we know about the Creator. So as far as the word Ralda means, as their name for the Heavenly Father, Ralda means most ancient. Sometimes he is referred to as All-Feder, which can be either All-Father or All-Feeder. The prefix with the WR in the Frisian language, it corresponds with the Germanic languages that have prefixes such as ORE or OER and UR, which it means primeval or original or most ancient. So Ralda, Alda means ancient, but the WR in front of it would mean the original, the most ancient. In fact, itself is mentioned in Scripture as the name of the of the Chaldeans, which was where Abraham was from, but it's also one of the most ancient cities of the earth. It mentions this wheel symbol, which you can see a picture of it here on the cover of the book. And all of the letters in the Frisian language were based upon this wheel. And you can see here, it's a picture actually from the book that shows the various letters and the various numbers there at the bottom. And this is a symbol which it is referred to as the Yule or the Yule wheel. And it's representative of time, the turning of time. So you can have the Yule wheel turning is 1 year, or sometimes the turning of the wheel can represent thousands of years. And to me, it reminds me of in Scripture, you have these different cycles of time that I've talked about, especially when I was doing the teachings on the sabbatical and jubilee years. You get to become really familiar with these different cycles of time that Scripture speaks about. And so the wheel here is representative of that also, this cyclical view of time. And we do see in Scripture that there is an association of wheels with Yahweh. Ezekiel comes to mind when he has this vision of the heavenly throne room, and the living creatures or the angels are there with these wheels. So whether it's a wheel as represented by this wheel of Ralda, or whether it's something different, I don't know, but it's definitely an association of wheels. The same with here in Daniel. I saw until thrones were placed, and one who was Ancient of Days, which is the literal meaning of Ralda's name, sat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels burning fire. So there is a connection there with the Oera Linda understanding of God and the Scripture. Moving on with the primal teachings, it says, among Finda's folk. Now, Finda was the progenitor of what's called the yellow races in this book. Among Finda's folk, there are witty men who, by the over-intensiveness, have become so corrupted that they convince themselves and their initiates that they are the best part of Ralda, and that their mind is the best part of Ralda's spirit, and that Ralda can only think by the help of their brains. The notion that every creature is part of Ralda's infinite being that they have taken from us, but their false reasoning and ungovernable pride have caused them to stray from the righteous path. And so this is getting into talking about this priest class, which has subverted the understanding of Ralda from the people. A lot of this you could apply to these interactions that Yeshua had with the Pharisees. If their mind was like Ralda's spirit, then Ralda would be very stupid, instead of being sensible and wise. For their minds always work like slaves, creating beautiful images which they afterwards worship. Rather, Finda's folk are a bad folk, for although their pseudo-wise men convince themselves that they are divine, they have created false divinities for the uninitiated, everywhere proclaiming that these divinities have created the world with all that is therein, greedy divinities full of envy and wrath, who want to be honored and served by the people, who want blood and sacrifice and demand rich offerings. These vain, false men, however, who have themselves referred to as God's servants or priests, receive, collect, and seize everything on behalf of the divinities that do not exist and keep it for themselves. They do all this with an easy conscience, as they imagine that they themselves are divine and answer to no one. So, of course, this is perfectly in line with what we see, the history that Peter talks about in the Nazarene Acts with these priests that are creating false gods for the means of enriching themselves. And you can see here that, according to the Oera Linda Book, the people started off with this correct view of the Creator, but it was usurped by these ones that it says are the descendants of Finda. So if we were to understand this again to be like the same type of people as the scribes and Pharisees, this is perfectly in line with Scripture, and it's also in line with things that I've talked about that I got from the Clementine writings, where Peter talks about how it was the priests who corrupted the Scriptures and added in sacrifices and ceremonies and such, and they did it with the intention of enriching themselves, collecting the tithes for God and putting it into their own pockets. If there are any who see through their vile tricks and try to expose them, these are caught by their henchmen and burnt for their defamation, always with solemn ceremonies in honor of their false divinities. But in truth, it is only to protect the priesthood, in order that our children may be armed against their idolatrous doctrine. The duty of the maidens is to make them learn by heart the following: Ralda existed before all things and will endure after all things. Thus, Ralda is eternal and infinite, and therefore nothing exists outside of him. From Ralda's life sprang time and all living creatures, and his life takes away time and all things. These facts must be made clear and manifest to all who are wise, so that they can define and demonstrate it to others. If that is understood, we can continue. Regarding our physical dimension, we are part of Ralda's infinite being, as is the physical dimension of all that was created. However, regarding our appearance, our characteristics, our mind, and our thoughts, these do not belong to the being. All these are volatile phenomena that appear throughout Ralda's life, and that appear as such through his wisdom and not otherwise. Whereas his life is continually progressing, however, nothing can remain stationary. Therefore, all creatures change their position and their shape, as well as their minds. Therefore, can neither earth itself nor any creature say, I am, but rather I was. Likewise, no man can ever say, I think, but merely I thought. So, of course, one of the names of Yahweh is the great I am. And the Oera Linda Book here is saying that the only person who can actually say I am is Ralda, because he's the one that doesn't change. But we as people or creatures or animals or whatever being is on earth, we're constantly changing, and so we're never the same 1 second later. We're in constant flux. So we should never say I am, but rather I was. So the only being that is suitable to have this title of I am is the Creator. In their language, it's Ralda. But I really do believe that this is a pure understanding of Yahweh. The boy is larger and different from when he was a child. He has other desires, passions, and ways of thinking. The man and his father is and thinks differently from when he was a boy. The same applies to the elderly. Everyone knows this. Since everyone thus knows and must acknowledge that one is continually changing, one must also acknowledge that one changes every instant. Also, whilst one says I am, and that one's thoughts changed, whilst one says I think, instead then of inappropriately imitating the bad findas and saying I am, or even I am the best part of Ralda, yes, through us alone can he think, we proclaim the following always and everywhere when it is necessary. We, Friar's children, are emergences through Ralda's life. In the beginning, mean and bare, but always becoming and advancing toward perfection, without ever becoming as good as Ralda himself. Our mind is not Ralda's spirit, it is merely a semblance of it. When Ralda created us, he provided us through his wisdom with brains, senses, memory, and many good qualities. By means of these we can contemplate his creations and his laws. From that we can learn, and about that which we can speak. All and only for our own benefit. If Ralda had not given us any senses, we would know nothing, and we would be yet more helpless than a jellyfish that is driven forth by the ebb and flow. So that was the end of their primal teachings, and so now we're moving into this subject of this prophet and priest struggle. Here you can see the reference to Atlant sinking. It says 101 years after Aldlin sank, folk came out of the east. These folks had been driven back by another people. Beyond our Twiskland, they fell into dispute. Twiskland is Germany. They divided into two large groups, and each went his own way. One part no account has come to us, but the other part invaded the rear of our Skeenland. Skeenland was sparsely populated, and at the coast, the rear the least at all. Therefore, they were able to occupy it without conflict, and as they did no other harm, we had no desire to go to war over it. So it was after this disaster, there were these people who moved in to be their neighbors and kind of took over this piece of land near them. But the Frisians said, we didn't see a need to fight over it. They weren't causing us any harm, so we allowed them to stay there. Now that we have come to know them, we want to write about their customs as well as our experiences with them. They were not wild like many of Fenda's tribes, but similar to the Egyptians. They have priests like them. And now that they have temples, idols as well. The priests are the only masters. They call themselves Magyars. This is probably connected to the Magi. One of the things that Asha Logos talks about on his channel is he finds numerous accounts of different priesthoods throughout the world, and they all have these titles like the Magus, the Magi. We have like Simon Magus from the recognitions and from the Bible, but you also have this priest class, and their names do change over time. So some of them could be like the Gauls. The Gauls were actually a priest class that ruled over the people we know as the Gauls, but the Gauls was not the actual name of the people originally. It was the name of their priests. So they call themselves Magyars. The supreme one is called Magus, again Simon Magus. He is the high priest and king in one. All other folk are trivial and entirely under their rule. They do not even have a name, but we call them Fens because although their feasts are altogether dreary and bloody, they are much more fine or formal than ours. So, here you see this, again, this formal priest class with their ceremonies and such coming in, and idols coming into the storyline. They are not to be envied, however, because they are slaves of the priests, and much worse, to their creeds. They believe that evil spirits are everywhere and enter into people and animals, but of Ralda's spirit they know nothing. The Finns have stone weapons. Their weapons of the Magyars are of copper. The Magyars claim that they can ban and banish the evil spirits. The Finns are always in fear because of this, and their faces never show signs of joy. When they were well settled, the Magyars sought our allegiance. They praised our language and customs, our cattle and iron weapons, which they were eager to exchange with their gold and silver ornaments, and they always kept their populace within their boundaries. That, however, made us complacent. 80 years later, the Yule Fest had just begun. They unexpectedly, and like a blizzard, covered our lands. Those who could not flee were killed. Freya was called upon, but the Skilanders had neglected her advice. Then forces were gathered. 3 poles from the Berg, the Magyars, were stopped. But war continued. Kate, or Catherine, was the name of the Berg maiden at Berg. Kate was proud and haughty, which kept her from asking the mother for advice or assistance. When the Berg lords realized this, however, they themselves sent messengers to the mother at Textland. Minna, as the mother was called, was summoned all steersmen and the other young folks of East Freeland and the Denmarks. From this expedition, the history of Woden was born, just as it was inscribed at the Bergs and written here. When the young warriors had assembled, they chose Woden as their army leader or king. The sea warriors chose Tunis as their sea king and Inca as their deputy by night. The navy then sailed into Denmark, where they took on board Woden and his brave army. The wind was fair, and so they shortly arrived in Skeenland. When the brothers of the north had joined them, Woden divided his powerful army into 3. Freya was their war cry, and thus drove back the Finns and Magyars as if they were children. So this is the origin of the mythology about Odin. And what you're going to see here is that when Woden defeated the Magyars, instead of staying hostile toward him, these Magyars had a different tactic. What they did was they made peace with Woden. They promoted him, made him a king, and basically kind of worked through him. Like they were there to undermine him. Rather than fighting him, they subverted him. And after he died, they deified him. And so that's where this pagan god Odin comes from, is from this man. And this is something you see throughout the Oera Linda, is that it shows how these pagan gods were all based upon people, exceptional human beings, but not gods. And these myths were not perpetrated by the Frisians. It was perpetrated by these what they call the Fendas folk, who is this priest class who does this for control. So they knew they couldn't fight against Woden, so they supplant him and basically become like his advisors and steer him in the direction they want to. Much like a certain tribe of people have supplanted the leadership in our country and used their influence to rule from the shadows. It's the same thing going on here. When the Magus heard how his men were being slain, he sent messengers with sepulchre and crown. They said to Woden, "O you greatest of kings, we are guilty, but all that we have done was done from necessity. You think that we took on your brothers willingly, but we were whipped forth by our enemies, who are still at our heels. We often asked your bird maiden for help, but she ignored us. You are the most heroic king on earth. Your folk are of iron. Become our king, and we shall willingly be your slaves. What honor it would be for you if you could drive back the savages. Our trumpets would resound with it, and our praises would precede you everywhere." So see, they're taking advantage of Woden's desire for power and glory by trying to usurp him instead of defeat him outright. It says, Woden was strong, fierce, and heroic, but he was not clear-sighted. Therefore he was caught in their trap and crowned by the Magus. After Woden was crowned, he attacked the savages. They were all horsemen and charged down on Woden's troops like a hailstorm. But like a whirlwind they turned back and did not dare to appear again. When Woden returned, the Magus gave him his daughter as a wife. He then was incensed with herbs, However, among them was magic herbs, and gradually Woden became so audacious that he dared to disavow and ridicule Freya and Ralda's spirit, while he bent his free neck before the images of false gods. His reign lasted 7 years, and then he disappeared. The Magyars said that he had been accepted among the gods, and that he ruled them from there, but our folk laughed at his words. So next we have a description of the maidens' tower, or their citadel, which we'd mentioned this earlier. It was to house this flame, this torch that was kept burning perpetually by the women that worked there, the virgins and the maidens that would keep this fire burnt. And there are numerous stories throughout the Oera Linda of war coming to one of their villages, and so the Berg maiden would have to flee with the lamp to keep the fire burning. And there were some stories about how disaster befell them, and the light it ended up going out, and they had to go to a different citadel to relight their lamp. And so this actually corresponds to, if you haven't picked up on that already, it actually corresponds to some of Yeshua's parables, and we'll get to that shortly. But here's a description of what the tower or the citadel looked like. It said, all the bergs are of the same shape, ours being the largest outside of Texland, which is the largest of all. The tower of Freya's Berg on Texland reaches the clouds, and the rest of the Berg is in proportion to it. Tasks at our Berg are divided so that 7 young maidens may attend the lamp in 3-hour shifts. In the remaining time, they do housework, study, and sleep. After 7 years of watching, they are free. Then they can go among the people to uphold morals and give advice. After having been a maiden for 3 years, they can sometimes join the older maidens. The scribe must teach the maiden apprentices to read, to write, to calculate. The gray or alderman must teach them justice and duty, knowledge of seeds, herbs, and healing, histories, tales, songs, and anything else that they may need for giving advice. The Berg maiden teaches them how to apply all this when advising people. So this, of course, brings to mind Yeshua's parables about the virgins keeping their lamps lit, and how some of them ran out of oil. I'm wondering if the origin of Yeshua's parable comes from this setup, the way that the citadels were set up with the practices of these maidens. The person writing this particular part of the Oera Linda says, my Berg is in the northernmost part of Ligarda. The tower has 6 sides, is 3 times 30 feet high, flat on top, and has a small observatory. On each side of the tower there is a building, 300 feet long, 3 times 7 feet wide, and equally high, except the roof, which is arched. The Berg is surrounded by a dike, and then a moat, 3 times 7 foot deep, 3 times 12 feet wide. Looking down from the tower, one sees the shape of the Yule. Between the buildings on the south side, a variety of native and foreign herbs grow, of which the maidens must learn all properties. So if you can imagine this, it's a high tower. So it says that it's laid out in the shape of their wheel, that 6-spoked Yule wheel. And so the tower would probably be the axis of the wheel, the center of the wheel. And stretching out from it, it was a round, a round complex. And so it looked like the Yule wheel from above. And it was surrounded by a wall and a moat. And it was, of course, then, surrounded with fields. And notice there were gardens here. On the north side are fields only. The 3 northerly buildings are filled with corn and other stock. 2 on the south are to house and school the young maidens. The southernmost building is the Berg maiden's home. In the tower, the lamp hangs. Its walls are decorated with precious stones. On the south wall, the text is written. To the right side of it, the Primal teachings, and to the left, the laws. The remaining 3 walls exhibit other text. So on the walls of these citadels, it is written there, primal teachings and the creation epic and such. And we saw that in the previous slides where we were reading about that. It was words that were actually copied from the walls of these citadels. So if you have a pretty good picture in your mind of the layout of one of these citadels, presumably I would think that different Bergs would maybe have different crops outside and such and so forth. This is a description of this one citadel in particular, but they all had the same basic layout according to the text. So reading this, it reminded me of an early Christian writing which didn't make it into the Bible, but the name of it was the Shepherd of Hermas. And the Shepherd of Hermas was a scriptural text that the church kept up until the Council of Nicaea. And it was not until the Council of Nicaea that the text was more or less rejected and kind of lost. And it was rediscovered recently, and so there are translations of it online if you have a desire to read that. But I find it interesting how close the description of a tower in the Shepherd of Hermas matches the description of these citadels. So in the Shepherd of Hermas, there's a tower that is actually spoken about quite extensively in the Shepherd. But this person, she, which is a personification of the church, says, "Do thou not see over against thee a great tower, which is built upon the water with bright square stones?" Okay, so the citadel that we just read about was made with precious stones, and here we have this tower built with bright square stones. The citadel we read about in the Oera Linda is surrounded by a moat, and here you see that this citadel, this tower, is built upon the water. So it sounds very similar to me. For the tower was built upon a square by these 6 young men that came with her, but many thousands of men brought stones. Some drew them out of the deep, others carried them from the ground, and gave them to the 6 young men, and they took them and built. And for those stones which were drawn out of the deep, they put them all into the building, for they are polished, and their squares exactly answered one another. And so one was joined in such a wise to the other that there was no space to be seen where they were joined, inasmuch as the whole tower appeared to be built as it was of one stone. So this parable or vision that's in the Shepherd of Hermas, it's about building the church. And so the church body, these stones represent people that are being brought to build this tower. But it seems to be calling upon a memory of these citadels that are described in the Oera Linda. The Shepherd of Hermas goes on to say, "About the gates stood 12 virgins, of which 4 that stood on the corners of the gate seemed to me to be the chiefest. Among the rest were also of worth, and they stood in the 4 parts of the gate. But those virgins which stood about the gate perceived that the building of the tower was to be hastened by them, and they stretched out their hands as if they were to receive somewhat from them to do. Then those 6 men commanded that they should lift up stones out of a certain deep place and prepare them for the building of the tower. And there were lifted up 10 white stones, square and not cut round." And it goes on, but this story I don't know if you call it a parable or a vision of these virgins working in this tower, sitting upon the water, it's prevalent throughout the Shepherd of Hermas. And it's a very close description with what we're being shown in the Oera Linda. And I can't help but think that there's a connection there. There's also a connection with Yeshua's parables, as I mentioned earlier. Here's one connection. Matthew 21, here another parable. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard, placed a fence around it, and dug a winepress in it, and built a tower and leased it to tenants. So in the same way that we just read the description of the tower in the Oera Linda, surrounded by crops, here you have this tower with a wall around it, just like the Citadel had a wall around it, and contained a wine press, and it was surrounded by this vineyard. Sounds again very, very similar to the way that the setup was for the tower in the Oera Linda. And again, I mentioned this earlier, Matthew 25, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, 5 were wise, and those who were foolish, when they took their lamps, took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. And notice at the bottom, the concern is they're concerned about the lamps going out, which is a theme that we see throughout the Oera Linda, repeatedly coming up. And here you have the conclusion of the parable. For time's sake, I'm not going to read it. So here we have a story that I found very interesting in the Oera Linda. It's a story about Minerva, who her nickname was Helena, and she was a Berg maiden and founder of Athens. And so in another part of the book, it goes through the whole story of the founding of Athens, but we're not going to read that here. But this exchange between Minerva and these priests is very, very reminiscent of the exchanges in the New Testament between Yeshua and the Pharisees. So the story begins, it says, when Helena, or Helena, whose own name was Minerva, was well established, and the Greeks loved her almost as much as their own folk, some princes and priests came to the Berg and asked her where her inherited estates, or Erva, was. Helena answered, I carry men, that is my Erva, my estates, in my heart. What I inherited is love of wisdom, justice, and freedom. If I lost that, I would be like the lowest of your slaves. Now I give advice for free, but then I would sell it. The dignitaries left and shouted mockingly, We are your obedient servants, wise Helena. But they failed in their ridicule, for the folk that loved and followed her took this name as a name of honor. When the dignitaries realized that they had missed their target, they started accusing her and said she had bewitched the folk. But our folk and the good Greeks asserted everywhere that it was slander. So this, like I mentioned, this is reminiscent of the interactions with the Pharisees. For instance, in John 8:48, the Judeans answered him and said, Don't we know well that you're a Samaritan and have a demon? So when they couldn't compete with Yeshua's wisdom, they turned to slander. Or when the Pharisees said, this man doesn't cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the king of demons, in Matthew 12. It's this tactic that the enemy, that the priest class goes to, of ridiculing and scorning people rather than addressing the true issue at hand, which is, look, if you teach anything contrary to the established religious dogma, you witness these attacks. I've had them myself. They don't want to actually address the things you talk about. They want to just slander you and call you names. And here you see it being reflected in this story with Minerva. Once they came and asked, so if you're not a sorceress, then what is the purpose of the eggs you always have with you? And Minerva answered, These eggs are the symbol of Phry's councils, in which our future, and that of all humankind, lies concealed. Time must hatch them, and we must protect them from being damaged. The priest replied, Well said, but what is that hound at your right-hand side for? And Helena answered, Does not the shepherd have a sheepdog to keep his herd together? Just like the dog serves the shepherd, I am in free service. I must watch over her flock. That makes sense indeed, said the priest. But tell us, what is the meaning of the night owl that is always sitting on your head? Might that light-shunning animal be the sign of your clairvoyance? I just want to notice the similarity with Yeshua's teachings. He's always talking about shepherds and flocks and sheep. And you see the same reflected in Minerva and the way that she is speaking. Speaking about serving the shepherd by essentially being a sheepdog. No, Helena answered, this is about the owl, he helps me remember that a certain kind of people is wandering the earth, also living in temples and holes, gnawing in the dark, but not like him, helping to rid us of mice and other plagues, but rather to invent tricks to rob other people of their knowledge, so that they can more easily seize and enslave them and suck their blood like leeches. If you'll remember, in Who is Esau Edom Part 6, which is not on YouTube. You have to go to Odyssey to watch it. I talk about this book. The name of the book is J-ish ritual sacrifice by Arnold Leese, who talks about the literal sucking of blood that this particular group of people does when it sucks the blood of children. It's possibly the origin of the vampire legends. So if you haven't watched Who is Esau Edom Part 6, I'll put a link in the description. You can go and view that. We'll go ahead and move on with the text. Once, when a plague had come to the land, they came with a crowd of people and said, "We are all making offerings to the gods so that they might ward off the plagues. Will you not help to calm their wrath? Or did you bring the plague over the land with your arts?" "No," Minerva says, "since I do not know any gods that do evil, I cannot ask them to be nicer. I only know one God, that is Ralda's spirit, and because God means good, he also does no evil." So do notice a similar view that Minerva has about God compared with the way Peter describes God in the Nazarene Acts. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but for now I'd like to finish the interaction with Minerva and the priests. But just notice that in her understanding here at the bottom in yellow, that God is only good. He doesn't have the capacity for evil or negative traits whatsoever. Continuing on, it says, "Where does evil come from then?" the priest asks. "All evil comes from yourselves and the stupidity of the people that walk into your trap. So that if your supreme being is all that good, then why does he not avert evil?" the priest asks. Helena answered, "Freya has put us on the path, and the creator, that is time, must do the rest. The carrier, which is time, must do the rest. For all disasters, counsel and help can be found, but Ralda wants us to search ourselves, so that we shall become strong and wise. If we refuse, he lets us squeeze out our own tumors, so that we shall experience the result of wise and foolish deeds." A prince replied, "I would imagine it better to simply ward off disaster." "Of course," Helena answered, "because then people would remain like tame sheep. You and the priests want to protect, but also to shear and slaughter them. But that is not what our supreme being wants. He wants us to help each other, but also that all be free and become wise, because we want that too. Our folk elects our leaders, aldermen, councilmen, and chieftains, and our masters from the wisest of the good people, so that all who do their best to become wise and good. This way we will know and teach the folk at the same time that only being wise and acting wisely leads to glory." "That is quite a statement," the priest says. "But you imply that the plague is a result of our ignorance. Then would not Helena be so good as to live up to her proud name and enlighten us?" "Yes," Helena said, "crows and other birds only feed on foul carrion, whereas the plague not only likes foul carrion, but also foul ethics, customs, and addictions. If you want the plague to leave for good, you must overcome the addictions, and all must become pure inside and out." "We want to believe your counsel is good," said the priest, "but tell us how we are supposed to improve all the people under our rule." Then Helena rose from her seat and said, "The sparrows follow the sower, the folk their good leaders. Therefore you must begin by purifying yourselves, so that you may look within and without turning red from shame before your own conscience. Now instead of purifying the people, you have invented foul feasts where they drink so obsessively that they end up rooting in the mud like pigs, ready to satisfy your vile lust." Just a note on the symbology used by Helena here. It's reminiscent of Yeshua's parables on the seed sower and various the themes of sowing seed. Notice that she uses the same she uses the same visual images for her parable. The people began to yell and scold so that she did not dare to engage in any further debate. One might have expected that they would have mobilized people everywhere to expel us altogether from the land. No, instead of accusing her, they went everywhere, even to the near Greek lands, up to the Alps, declaring that it had pleased the most supreme being to send his wise daughter Minerva, nicknamed Nehelenia, among the people in a cloud from the sea to give them good counsel, and that all who would hear her should become rich and happy, and eventually should rule the whole kingdom of the earth. They erected statues of her on their altars and sold them to the simple people. So notice this the same tactic they used with Woden. Instead of attacking him, they basically like co-opted his persona. And here they're co-opting Helena's persona and creating this whole false religion around her that she herself would have never agreed to. And it's the same thing that the church, I would say, has done with Yeshua. They've taken his teachings and they have co-opted his persona, and they've developed this whole religion that gives him lip service, but it really doesn't stay true to any of his teachings. So you're going to see this continue on with what they do to Minerva, but it's eerily similar to what I see the church doing to Yeshua. They announce counselors everywhere that she had never given, so they relate teachings that she never gave. Relate miracles that she had never performed. They cunningly made themselves masters of our laws and customs, and they managed to explain and distort them all through misinterpretations. Does that not sound like the Edomites today? They also placed maidens under their care, pretending that these were under the care of Festa, our first honorable mother, to watch over the divine light. However, they had lit that light themselves, and instead of properly educating these maidens before sending them among the people to nurse the sick and teach the children, they kept them ignorant and dimmed their light and did not allow them to come outside. So now they're creating this counterfeit of the whole setup with the Berg maidens. They're making their own Berg maidens, which this, of course, is the Sibyls. That is actually written about in the scriptures at one point, but they are these. It's a false counterfeit. There were also meaning the false, the Sibyls were also used as counselors, but that counsel only appeared to come from their own lips, or from the priest's own lips, as in reality their lips were nothing but the mouthpiece through which the priest promulgated their own desires. When Helena died, we wanted to choose another mother. Some wanted to go to Texland to ask one there. However, the priest, who had regained power over the people, would not permit that and accused us before the people of being impious. So again, what I said before, when the priest class when their lies can't compete with your own truth, this is what they do. They accuse you of being impious in the same way they accused Yeshua of being demon-possessed. Also, just another line from the Shepherd of Hermas. This vision that this person in the Hermas is seeing, he says, "Moreover, brethren, it was revealed to me as I was sleeping by a very goodly young man, saying to me, What thinkest thou of that old woman with which thou received the book? Who is she?" And he answered, "A Sibyl." And the person replies, says, "Thou art mistaken. She is not." And I reply, "Well, who is she then, sir?" And he answered me, "It is the church of God." And I said unto him, "Why then does she appear old? She is therefore," said he, "an old woman, because she was the first of all creation, and the world was made for her." So this in itself sounds like some of the descriptions of Freya from the Oera Linda. And with regards to the three mothers being women, as opposed to in the Bible like Shem, Ham, and Japheth, you also have Yeshua. I guess as an interesting side note, what does he say about John the Baptist? Among those born of women. So according to the Oera Linda, all of mankind was born from these three women. And then Yeshua mentions, of course, those born of women. So is he referring to Eve, or is he referring to, again, could it be that he is referring to these three women, Freya, Fenda, and Lydda? I don't know. So before we end, I do want to review from the Nazarene Acts, or rather this is actually from the homilies, from the Clementine homilies, Peter's view of God. And of course this is Peter's view of God that Yeshua had explained to him. So we can say this is Yeshua's view of God. And I think this lines up with Yeshua's statements in the scripture regarding his view of the Father. So just as we're closing here, just compare the way that Peter describes God with the way that the Oera Linda describes God, as not being capable of any evil, perfectly good. And so as we end the video, I'll read this. Peter says, "For the scriptures have joined to them many falsehoods against Elohim on this account. The prophet Moses, by the order of Elohim, delivered the Torah with the explanations to his 70 chosen men, in order that they might instruct such of the people as they chose. After some time, the written Torah had added to it a certain falsehoods, contrary to the Torah of Elohim, who made the heaven and the earth and all things in them, the evil one having dared to work this for his evil purpose. This took place in reason and judgment, that those who might be convicted, who should dare to listen to the things written against Elohim, and those who through love toward him should not only disbelieve the things spoken against him, but should not even endure to hear them at all, even if they should happen to be true, judging it much safer to incur danger with respect to religious faith than to live with an evil conscience on the fact of blasphemous words." So out of all the things I talk about on my channel, this is probably the one thing that makes people more upset than anything else, is when I say that I don't believe everything written in the Bible. I don't think the whole Bible is, this infallible, perfect book, because only God himself is infallible. And you can't if you're calling a book infallible, you're making that book into a god. And that just infuriates people. But here's the explanation from Peter. He's saying it's much safer to reject something written in that book that paints God in a negative light than to just believe that book out of your religious doctrine and end up believing something bad about Yahweh. Moving on, it says, "Wherefore, far be it from us to believe that the Master of all, who made the heaven and the earth and all things that are in them, shares his government with others, or that he lies. For if he lies, then who speaks the truth? Or if he makes experiments as in ignorance, who foreknows? If he deliberates and changes his purpose, who then is perfect in understanding and permanent in design? If he envies, who is above rivalry? If he hardens hearts, who makes wise? If he makes blind and deaf, who has given sight and hearing? If he commits pilfering, who administers justice? If he mocks, who is sincere? If he is weak, who is omnipotent? If he is unjust, who is just? If he makes evil things, who makes good things? And if he does evil, who will do good? But if he desires a fruitful hill, whose then are all things? If he is false, who is true? If he lives in a tent, who is without bounds? If he is fond of fat and sacrifices and offerings and drink offerings, who then is without need? And who is holy and pure and perfect? If he is pleased with lamps and wicks, who then placed the luminaries in the sky? If he dwells in shadow and darkness and storm and smoke, who is the light that lightens the universe? If he comes with trumpets, shoutings, darts, and arrows, who is the sought-after tranquility of all? If he loves war, then who wishes peace? If he makes evil things, who makes good things? If he is without affection, who is a lover of men? If he is not faithful to his promises, who will be trusted? If he loves evil, adulterers, and murderers, who will be a just judge? If he changes his mind, who is steadfast? If he chooses evil men, who takes the part of the good? Wherefore, Clement, my son, beware of thinking otherwise of Elohim than that he is the only Elohim, Master and Father, good and righteous, the Creator, long-suffering, merciful, the Sustainer, the Benefactor, ordaining love of men, counseling purity, immortal and making immortal, incomparable, dwelling in the souls of the good, who cannot be contained, and yet is contained within the heart, who has fixed the great world as a center in space, who has spread out the skies and solidified the land, who has stored up the water, and who has disposed the stars in the skies, who has made the fountains flow in the earth, has produced faults, has raised up mountains, has set bounds to the sea, has ordered winds and blasts, and who by the spirit of counsel has kept safely the body comprehended in a boundless sea. This is our judge, to whom it behooves us to look and to regulate our own souls, thinking all things in his favor, speaking well of him, persuaded that by his long suffering he brings to light the obstinacy of all and is alone good. And he, at the end of all, will sit as a just judge upon every one of those who have attempted what they ought not. Okay, so that's all I have for the readings from the Oera Linda book. I do highly recommend that you download a copy of it and read it. It's from the first time I read it, it's not been very far out of my thoughts the entire time. I'm constantly coming back to it and kind of meditating on what it says and thinking about the words in it. And I'll put some links in the descriptions to the videos that Asha Logos did about the Oera Linda. He did 3 different videos about this one particular book. And me covering it in one video doesn't do it justice. He gets really in-depth into it and brings out some more of the connections to the, not really connections to Scripture, but connections to his theory that at one point pretty much the entire earth was in this struggle between prophet and priest, and he doesn't necessarily say it like that, but he, I think he's on to something with that. But this book is, it really is something. It's I can't speak highly enough of how good it is. So, thank you for listening. I pray that this has been a blessing to you. Shalom.